What's up, everybody? Welcome in to another edition of SSPN Live. Ethan, it's the I-35 series weekend edition. We're
Mm,
recording this on Thursday, and the Spurs are in Austin, I think, already. They've been in Austin doing a bunch of promos and stuff. I saw today there was like this one worker for the Spurs that was just walking around downtown that
mhm.
with a cardboard sign that
I
said
think I saw that.
bring us nuggets. Like that's just the type of stuff that they were doing. Obviously that plays into the game tomorrow with
Mm,
the Spurs going up against the Denver Nuggets in Austin. And we were just talking about it pre-stream, man. I'm a little bit closer to Austin, to be honest. So, I always kind of consider those games. I went to one game against the Trailblazers last year in Austin. Um, but man, those ticket prices, they're a little bit more expensive, Ethan, and that's probably because there's less seats in the
mm.
Moody Center. But what I will say is that makes for a very cool environment as I've been there myself. So I'm excited to see kind of the cheers of the fans kind of echoing throughout the stadium, if you will, because it is a little bit smaller. That was kind of what I experienced last year. And I'm just excited to see the Spurs, kind of just with a little bit of a different energy with it being in Austin. We kind of saw that last year, and it'll be really cool to see how kind of the Austin crowd reacts now that, of course, Victor Wembanyama will be playing for the Spurs this season.
Absolutely agreed. I think another reason the crowds are always more energetic, and not always more energetic, but a different feel, is because of the amount of college kids from UT who I'm sure will be swarming the stands and trying to buy every ticket they can possibly buy. The fraternities will be out. It'll be a college atmosphere, like Mr. Victor Wembanyama is saying. So yeah, absolutely excited. It's kind of fun just to kind of branch out and change things up a little bit. I'm sure the players enjoy playing in a different environment, but still having that home court advantage, if you will.
Yeah, absolutely. And the other thing is most of these guys spent other than like Victor and I think Jeremy. That's really the only people on the roster that I can think of, other than maybe some veterans, but guys that we drafted. I mean, that
Yeah.
didn't spend time in Austin. On the Austin Spurs. So there's also a little bit of that connection too, as well as with Austin just kind of like blowing up as a city and kind of being more popular, just as kind of like a tourist trap type of deal.
Mhm.
It's kind of getting into that LA, New York territory. It's definitely a lot different than that.
Yeah.
But at the same time, with it growing the way that it is, I think that's another thing that kind of would maybe excite the players a little bit. But really, as someone who went to the Trailblazers game last year, the thing that really stood out to me is one, this is a very new stadium and it's very high quality. Um,
Mm.
so it's just a really cool place to play in. And like I harped on a little bit earlier, because it's still like bigger than most college stadiums, but it's not as big as an NBA stadium. So it just makes for a really cool environment. Like I kind of mentioned, the sound like it almost feels louder because it's a smaller, more compact space, if you will. So I'm
Mm.
excited to watch those games. Obviously, the first one against the Denver Nuggets, Ethan. As much as that will be cool, and people will probably pack that stadium out to see Victor and Nicola,
Mhm.
um, that will definitely be a tough test for the Spurs and the tougher of the two games that they have to play. And it kind of reminds me of last year, Ethan, because we won the game against the Trailblazers and then we got blown out against the Timberwolves in the two games in Austin last year.
Mm.
And I think the Spurs have a chance to be competitive, and I think especially with the Wemby energy, there was already a ton of energy last year. You're going to add that with all of the college kids, like we talked about. I think they have a chance to make this Denver game competitive if they can execute and come out, and play their best game. But it's also winding down to the end of the season. And that's exactly when the Nuggets are trying to kick in gear and kind of
Mhm.
get ready, to play with that playoff intensity. So I'm not expecting us to win the game against Denver. And yeah, that just kind of leads into your preview and your thoughts on that first one tomorrow night against the Denver Nuggets.
Yeah, I don't think it's a hot take to necessarily say that the Nuggets will win this game, in my opinion. Um, I'm hoping it will be competitive as well, at least for like the first half. Like this strikes me as one of those games that we're coming out with great energy. We're playing in front of a different crowd. It's the Wemby versus Jokic hype. He'll probably get his. There'll be a lot of highlights. So grab your popcorn buckets, enjoy the show. But it'll come down to reality in the second half, Jude, where Nikola Jokic and really the uninjured Denver Nuggets, the only guy that they have out is Vlatko Kanchar. I don't even know if I'm saying that
You
name
are.
right. Um, so they have their core pieces there. They have Aaron Gordon, Nikola Jokic, Jamal Murray, Michael Porter Jr., and we may have Keldon Johnson and Chetty Osman out. I don't know if that's been updated, but according to ESPN, they're both day to day. Keldon with an illness, Chetty Osman with an ankle. So without them, we're even thinner than usual. They're two big, strong bodies um, that create a lot of offense for us. So it'll be a struggle for sure, to say the least. And like I said, not a hot take thinking that Nikola Jokic will come out on top.
Yeah, and just for context, the last game that we did play against them, they beat us 132 to 120. So,
Mm.
granted, that was much earlier in the season. And let me go check. This may have been when Victor was still playing the four here. And yes, as we can see by the
Mm.
starting lineup, he was. But he did have a really solid game: 22, 6 steals, 4 blocks. So 10 combined steals and blocks the last time that we played the Nuggets. And once again, this is when Victor's only playing 25 minutes and is still at the four. Found a way to get 11 boards too. So I think that speaks to, kind of him stepping up to the level of competition and taking the challenge
Mm-hmm.
of playing Jokic. But this is going to be a little bit more unique. And of course, got to mention here, Jokic had 39, 11, and 9. So he
Yep.
definitely got his. But I will be excited to see, more of that one-on-one matchup this time because Victor's playing the five now.
Yeah, it'll be interesting to see how they defend him. I can't remember who guarded him last time. I want to say it was probably Aaron Gordon who probably guarded him for most
Mm-hmm.
of the game. Um, and I'm assuming that Wemby probably didn't guard Jokic that much unless he was switched on to him. I think they
Right.
probably would have thrown Zach Collins at him. So we've seen him get bullied by Joel Embiid and Cat, like you alluded to. This will be a really good test for him to see how he's kind of grown from those two beatdowns and how he can slow down a big physical center in Nikola Jokic.
Yeah, and just to kind of tie into what you were talking about earlier, how you feel like this could be a game where we come out with a lot of energy, in that first half at least, and then maybe things tail off in the second half. Obviously, Denver's gaining some momentum right now. They're
Mm-hmm.
on a 4-game win streak, and then they had an overtime loss before that. But the thing about us, now that I'm just turning this back to the Spurs side of things, Ethan, is as much as the Golden State loss was a 10-point loss, that was very close, competitive for most of the game. And then, of course, the way that the Houston game went, I actually sat down and watched that one. It was it was definitely frustrating to say the least, with Ime Udoka deciding to foul us,
Yep.
being up 3, and just preventing us from having any chance in isolation with like Devin or Wemby to maybe have a chance to tie it and send it to overtime. The point is, 2 competitive, tough losses. And I think that will definitely give, on top of being in Austin, I think that will also add to the motivation that the Spurs could have just coming out in this first one. I still don't think the Spurs are going to pull this one out just because it's
Mm-hmm.
the 46-20 Denver Nugget defending champion Denver Nuggets. No, I said Denver Nuggets twice there, but had to throw in the defending champion aspect. This will be a tough one. Even though looking at those last two losses being tough, I think we will come out and give them a good first couple rounds if you want to make a boxing analogy.
Mm-hmm.
But I think that later on they will pull away.
Yeah, Wemby's going to have a great game. I think Victor Wembanyama in the comments was saying something similar and how that would reflect in a win. I think Wemby will have a classic, amazing stat line. ESPN will have something that he did that no one else has done in history of the league. Those kind of
Mm-hmm.
headlines. But at the end of the day, it's going to come down to, are we able to stop the other guys for Denver? And I'm talking about Michael Porter Jr., who I think had 25 in the last game. Jamal Murray has been prone to go off on the Spurs. I mean, the list goes on. Aaron Gordon could suddenly have a 30-point game. Like, it's all possible. They're a very deep and experienced team.
Yeah, and also here we're Victor's talking about this a little bit in the comments, but just the reality of this being literally the 1 seed in the West versus the bottom seed in the West. So that's why, as you were saying, Ethan, it is not a hot take that the Nuggets will probably pull this one out. They're also 9-1 in their last
Mm-hmm.
10, which is the best in the conference, probably best in the league. But let
Yep.
me scroll up and see there. Yep.
Yep. And I know we beat OKC and Minnesota when they were both number 1 seeds at the time. but I would put them in a completely different category than the Denver Nuggets. Like Nikola Jokic is an MVP, a two-time MVP, defending champions. They're all veteran players. There's not like a weak link necessarily to their team. Maybe bench play, but that starting five is really strong, um, and they've done it at the highest of levels. So it's a little different of a situation.
Yeah, I mean, OKC and Minnesota are really kind of blossoming into top
Mhm.
teams in the West where, you know, the Nuggets, even though last year was their first year finally breaking through and winning that championship, who knows what happens if Jamal Murray doesn't get injured? I believe that was in the bubble, correct?
No, he was playing in the bubble because he went crazy. Remember, he was like the MJ of the bubble.
Okay.
But it
Okay.
was the year after that where he was hurt, and I think Michael Porter
He
Jr.
was
was
hurt for
also
2
hurt.
years too, right?
Yeah, that's right. So they've been contending even with the injuries for a few years. I think is the point you're getting to. Like 4 or 5 years, they've been in that championship hunt. They just broke through because finally injuries did not plague their season.
That was exactly what I was trying to say there, Ethan. But that is not the only game that the Spurs have this weekend in
Mm.
Austin. And the second game is against the Brooklyn Nets. And I do think maybe this all gets mucked up and it's backwards, Ethan. But I really do think just because of the Austin energy that the Spurs are going to go 1-1. I don't think they're going to go 0-2 in these games. I think just like last year, they'll go 1-1. And I think Brooklyn is the game to do it. And like I said, maybe there's a chance that the Spurs pull off some crazy upset. I think in the case that does happen, I think they'd end up dropping this one just because still,
Mm.
once again, the Spurs are the bottom team in the West and inconsistent. But at the same time, if we're just being realistic with this thing and looking at this through a logical lens, Brooklyn would be the much more realistic game for the Spurs to win. And I believe that they lost their last game as well. Let me go and pull up the series history here because
They beat
I
us in game one.
and we were talking about like when we did an episode where we previewed that game and
Mm.
I felt like we had a chance in it and then we weren't able to pull it out.
Correct.
So it would be nice to get some get back here in Austin against the Nets on NBA TV, I might add.
I think what I remember from that game is they just caught fire from three, and we were having a very difficult time chasing 3-point shooters around the perimeter and giving wide open looks, which is, again, been a theme throughout the entire year, Jude. But what's crazy about the Nets that's different about the Nuggets, like you expect that from the Nuggets because we have to double team, triple team, and switch to defend Nikola Jokic. They don't really have anybody that we have to double team. And Ben Simmons, who actually had a solid game against us, is out uh,
Yes.
in 3 days or whenever we play them. So there's really no excuse for why we should continue to give up wide open threes like that. I mean, it's a well-rounded team. They got energy. They got a couple nice players, but I agree. I think this is the one that we can sneak a win out of.
Yeah, and just pulling up the box score here, like you said, they hit 6 more threes than the Spurs. They also shot almost 20% better from three than the Spurs in that game. The Spurs got to the line a ton more and still lost by 20. So that's kind of an example of the a little bit of the mucked upness of the offense. Devin, had not a crazy game, a little bit inefficient, you could say, but still not too terrible. Wemby, 7 for 16, 21, 4 and 3. So
Mm.
wasn't able to assert himself on the board as much with the Nick Claxton matchup. And I remember Nick Claxton
Yeah,
made some plays watching that one. He had 20 and 11. That's somebody we'll have to watch out for, especially when you look at some of the other teams that have been playing Wemby better defensively, kind of like the Rockets were really for like the first 3 quarters of the game on Tuesday. I believe like going into the second half, Wemby only had 2 points. I believe he ended up finishing with like 17 or something like that.
yeah,
Maybe a little bit more than that. But regardless, the point that I'm getting at here is that it seems like some teams have been able to develop some schemes to better defend Wemby. And then on top of that, Nick Claxton did a solid job, at least on the offensive boards, and had a good game for himself. Obviously, Wemby was still able to get 21. 4 of those points came at the line, but 9 of those points came from outside.
yeah.
From what my memory really serves me, Ethan, Nick Claxton did a pretty good job and had to force him outside, at least on the interior. You know
Mm.
what I'm saying? Cam Thomas had 25 as well. That really sticks out to me with
Dennis
Devin
Schroeder.
Devin defensively.
Mm.
He'll have to lock in on Cam Thomas. And thank you for mentioning that, because he went crazy with 15 and 12. And as
Mhm.
much as he didn't have the most efficient game when you look at this, I mean, it still is pretty solid. But if you just look at the field goal percentage, I remember watching this one and just being like, wow, he stood out.
Yeah, this was a crazy game for them because they had a bunch of guys go off that never would go off ordinarily. Like Dennis Smith Jr. is a solid defender now, but I don't think anybody would have expected him to get 14, 6, and 2. Like that's a great stat line for him. And pretty much everybody was positive in the plus minus for the Nets. I just remember it being a complete disaster defensively for the Spurs. And then, like you said, defensively, they were able to put kind of a stopper and play really physical against Victor Wembanyama, kind of like how the Rockets are always physical with Victor Wembanyama. The Nets are able to do that as well. But I expect to bounce back. I think a lot of our players will play better this time around. I think defensively we have definitely improved. And being in Austin again, I mean, I know that's kind of an intangible quality, but playing in front of those fans on your home court, or not home court, technically home court, but you know what I mean, in front of San Antonio Spurs fans in Austin in that environment. I think, and on national TV, the NBA TV game, I think it's a recipe for a Spurs win. I just they have to put it together, please. Like to put it simply, don't have it a turnover fest, please.
Yeah, and you got to have an efficient night shooting, and you can't let some of their guys get hot, because if you let Mikal Bridges get
Mm-hmm.
hot, you let Cam Thomas get hot, that's 40 points right there,
Mm-hmm.
from the jump. And that means you're just going to have to match it. And maybe you can with Devin and Wemby, but then you're relying on the other guys. And as much as sometimes they can make plays, we've also seen games in that situation specifically where they haven't been able to.
Yep.
So defense for me, defensive intensity and rotations to and just force. And I get that Cam Thomas and Mikal Bridges, for that matter, are tough shot makers,
Yep.
but I'd rather put them in that. You got to put them in that situation early, and you got to hound them and be physical with them from the start. Because, like I said, if you let them get easy shots, then it's just going to be easy points.
Absolutely. Couldn't agree more. And I seem to remember also, side note, this was one of
Go
those
ahead.
games where Zach Collins got benched in the first half because he had 3 fouls
That's
in
right.
7 minutes. And then we played Barlow the rest of the night, who didn't have a great game. I think he only had 12 minutes himself. But when Victor's already being hampered because of the size of Brooklyn and we don't have a true backup big, you see what I'm saying. Recipe for
Yes,
disaster.
for sure. That's just one of the ingredients of the 20-point loss that the
Mm-hmm.
Spurs took in February. But the last thing that I'll say about this one, Ethan, notice Shetty Osman is already listed as out
Mm-hmm.
for this game on March 17th. So this definitely has to do, we made that little clip a while back called the Spurs tanking strategies. And I don't think that Shetty Osman playing, whether he played or not, was really going to be the difference at the end of the day. But notice all of a sudden in the end of the season here, Ethan, we did talk about this, that there's these little injuries where now for some reason Shetty's out for like 4 games, even though he looks completely normal on the sideline. It's like, I wonder if that's just a ploy to give Barlow minutes, because that's what we've been randomly doing recently. Um, and then on top of that, you also had Keldon out last night, so you saw some Mamu minutes as
Mm-hmm.
well. And really Barlow was making some mistakes I'm mixing up the 2 games that we had on Monday or Tuesday, but in one of those games he was making some mistakes. We ended up putting Mamu in. I think that was the Rockets game that I'm referring to, although he didn't have the greatest game on Monday either. But that's besides the point. The point is that Shetty Osman is also out, so we're definitely going to be seeing some different guys in some of these games. We've even been seeing some Devonte Graham minutes
We have.
as of late, Ethan.
And he's been impressive, honestly. Like considering we always tease about Devonte Graham never getting play time and how he's the recipe for winning a championship if we were only to give Devonte Graham minutes, and we make that joke a lot. Give him credit. He was ready to play when Bob called his name, and he's been playing meaningful minutes, impactful minutes, scoring the ball, being a facilitator. He's never going to be a great defender just because of his size mismatch, but I've been happy with his veteran leadership and what he's been able to provide us.
Yeah, Absolutely. And he's been taking tough shots, or not, I say tough shots. He's been taking smart shots. A lot
Hmm.
of threes. It almost looks like he's fading away every time he
Yeah,
shoots
right.
just because of his jumper. That's why I kind of said that at the beginning. But it's been kind of surprising, even though it's only just some spot minutes here and there. And
Mm.
it's like, I wonder, at the beginning of the year, that kind of goes back into a whole nother conversation. But I just kind of wonder what maybe it would have looked like a little bit earlier in the year when we were having some point guard struggles. I don't think it would have been an all around solution. That's not what I'm saying at all. But I'm just kind of curious what it would have looked like if maybe he would have got some minutes earlier.
Well, yes, I think this is another subtle tank move. I don't think any of us really wanted him to get minutes
We didn't.
because, like, sure, is he better than Blake Wesley right now? Maybe. Offensively, for sure. Would he have been helpful to us? Maybe win a couple games. Probably hit some big shots. But at the end of the day, like, we're not winning regardless. Let's give Blake Wesley those minutes. Let's let him develop. We tried the Sohan thing at point guard. It didn't work, but I think he improved from that experiment. Um, and it's Devontae Graham. Like, no disrespect, but like, I don't think he's going to be on the Spurs next year.
Yeah, and I wasn't trying to say either. Like I said,
No, I know what you were
I
saying.
was trying to be very clear that I don't think it would have been a huge difference. But
Yeah.
in the beginning of the season, where like Blake's still in Austin,
Hmm.
that it would have. I'm just curious what some of those games would have looked like. But at the end of the day, Ethan, it really doesn't matter because when it comes to the Sohan experiment, like I'd rather try that and see, and then on the flip side, in the alternate universe where it works, then you have your starting lineup.
Hmm.
But at the end of the day, still like I'd rather throw out the Jeremy thing because I don't know the ceiling on that potentially in comparison to Devonte Graham, where I do know the ceiling.
Hmm.
And then obviously with the way that Blake has developed, that's just a no brainer. But it just ties into the stuff that we've talked about, Ethan, whenever it comes to the subtle tank that moves that the Spurs have made, but also just the fact that in this season where you're not going to win the championship, you'd rather throw out Jeremy and Blake Wesley than Devonte Graham and have higher draft odds. That's really what it comes down to.
1,000%. And development on the fly.
There you go. There you go. But that pretty much sums up our Austin preview, if you will, here, Ethan. Any final thoughts on this Brooklyn game?
I hope we can sneak a win, go 1-1 in Austin. That would go a long way for my mental health.
That would be nice. I just want to go 1-1. I really think that they will get this. They'll get this Brooklyn win back. They'll lose to the Nuggets, but it'll be okay because we'll be happy on Sunday.
Hmm.
Maybe doing a post game. We'll see how that works out. Um, and regardless of if we're doing a post game or not, if they get that win against Brooklyn on Sunday, I will be very happy going into the week, Ethan.
Me too, my friend.
But that leads us into our second topic today, Ethan. And this is something that has kind of become more legitimate to me over the course of the season. And that's basically, y'all see it in the title if you're watching, and it says Offseason Moves Incoming. And I'm just basically going to ask this question, Ethan, and then we're going to dive into the ins and
Mm.
outs of it. But essentially, because of how good Victor already is, how
Mm.
he's progressed, how much he wants to win, the situations that he's put us in. Not the last Rockets game on Tuesday, but the one last week where you did the post game. One of my friends was talking about it, and you were talking about it as well. The Rockets were able to just clog the paint, leave Trey Jones and Jeremy Sohan open. Now, granted, I will say Jeremy Sohan shooting this season with the
Mhm.
improvement it's made, if he can do that again, I think there's potential there for him to just at least be a respectable shooter. And Trey Jones shot really well in
Yeah,
the
right.
Rockets game, I do have to say. But overall,
Hmm.
able to clog the paint, leave those guys open. We're not able to make them pay. But the bigger point is with how good Wemby already is, and the excess, keyword here, excess of assets that the
Hmm.
Spurs have acquired with the DeJounte Murray trade, the DeMar DeRozan trade, the Derek White trade, the Jakob Poeltl trade. You could even go back to the Kawhi trade if you want to. Do the Spurs make a move this offseason? A big splashy move, if you will. And when I say that, it doesn't even have to necessarily be like a high caliber all-star, but somebody like a move that brings in a significant upgrade in talent and signals a change in philosophy with the
Mm.
team next season.
It's a great question, Jude. I think the apprehension from some Spurs fans, including myself a little bit, I can see both sides, is the Spurs have always been process oriented. We've always put the front office and the coaching staff's like thought process first before the players, and we've always had, thankfully, players that understand that and are willing to play along. And it's been successful. 5 championships later, 20 seasons, 50 wins in a row. It's been successful, clearly. Um, we have a lot of young talent. We have a lot of assets. There's a part of me that says, you know what? Let's just play it out. Let's just play it out. Let's continue doing what we're doing, drafting high, building players around Wemby that they can grow together. And I completely see the logic behind that. I'm not against that. However, I think with where the league is currently, with who Victor Wembanyama is, he's not Tim Duncan. He's more he's a very smart, mature man for his age, but he's also extremely competitive, a little more vocal. I feel he has a camp like Tim Duncan. You never heard a word out of him, right? He was just like, I'm here to play basketball,
Mm-hmm.
pop at RC. Y'all do everything else. I don't care. I will compete no matter who I'm with. Wemby wants to win, and at a certain point, you're going to have to make moves. So my thought process is yes, a move will be made this summer. I don't think it'll be a free agency move. I think that there will likely be a trade. I don't know for who or what we're giving up, but I have to see that the Spurs are making a move this offseason, Jude. Yes.
And this has been a big thing that's been talked about in the Spurs world. And if you've watched this channel for a while, you know that, I mean, I've even in the last time where we kind of discussed this conversation, I believe it was in the Trae Young video. I made it clear, like I'm not
Mhm.
necessarily this guy who's like, oh, we got to accelerate the timeline right now. Or even over the
Right.
past couple years since we've been doing SSPN since 2021,
Mm-hmm.
like we've heard people say that, oh, like we need to a big contingent of the Spurs fan space. That's what I mean when I say people.
Mm-hmm.
Like even in years past, like when DeJounte was still here, oh, we need to make a big trade. Even after DeJounte leaves, oh, we need to make a big trade. You know what I mean? Or after Derek leaves, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and we've never really been that. Very much, I would say that we've embraced the rebuild.
Mm-hmm.
But what I will say is over this season and really in the past like month and a half, I would say I don't want to say this was like a light bulb moment because I see some comments that we're already getting, and I think that there's some good points being made. Like I'll bring this up right now from blah blah blah. He says, "I think it's silly to think that the Spurs could suddenly just compete with with Wemby and another player, especially Trae Young. We are not that close. We shouldn't rush, make a splashy move." And that's what we're going to get into. We're going to get into the pros and cons. Like I asked you, what do you think? And then now we'll get into the pros and cons, right? And I'll give what I think as well, just to answer that question also. Um, and I think that that's a good point that he brings up. But with that being said, with what we've seen from Victor and when I was talking about the light bulb moment earlier, I don't know if it might have been the Thunder game.
Mm-hmm.
Was that the first game when we were back at home, or was that
We,
both? Was
yes,
that
that
the
was home.
Pacers game?
That was home because he was like, I love this blank.
Okay, that's the moment. That's the game, right? Yeah. I saw his passion and like obviously he's wanted this all year, but that combined with the progression of his, I know it's been a rough season. The Spurs are what? Let's pull up the record here. They're 14 and 52.
Mm-hmm.
So obviously, you know that it's when you say the progression, some people be like, "Oh, well, what progression are you talking about?" If you've been a diehard Spurs fan and you've actually watched the games this season, you have seen a complete progression, even with the team, not just with Victor, but with the team since moving him to the center position. Obviously, there haven't been a lot of wins, and that kind of ties into what you talked about whenever it came to the state of the league and why you kind of think that they will make this move. And that at the end of the day is also kind of why I think they will end up making a move either. I don't know if it'll be Trae Young, you know. I don't know exactly Like maybe it's not as splashy as we think, but I think that the Spurs here's the other aspect of this that I haven't brought up yet. We're not going to be able to pay everybody we've drafted. So eventually we're going to probably want to move some of these guys, or we're just going to let them go for nothing.
Mm-hmm.
So that's why when I opened this up, I said excess of assets. And we'll get into some other things too, but I'm thinking about if you could bring in like a relatively all-star level point guard. I'm not even saying Trae Young. This is totally theoretical. An offensive initiator, and you're able to keep Devin in that move, and then you can have two shooters and an actual playmaker to put next to Victor. Like your teams aren't going to be able to clog the paint like they were, like we were mentioning earlier.
Mm-hmm.
And Wemby's not going to get I want him to get rewarded whenever he's trying as hard as he is. I know that he's someone who's got a really level head and is understands the process and grew up loving the Spurs. But you don't want to waste this opportunity, and you want to show to him at the same time that, hey, we want to reward you for all of the good things that you do. We don't want teams to just be able to run this defense and then your teammates can't execute. And maybe down the line in their careers they'll be able to, but at this point, unfortunately, that's a scheme that's been effective.
Mm-hmm.
And I also think just with 2 straight seasons going the way that they have, I think also that that'll have another kind of sense of urgency, if you will, added to it. But it's more just about how good Victor is.
Yeah.
That and wanting him. I don't want I know I'm kind of rambling here,
Oh, you're
but
good.
this is how I'll wrap it up. I don't want teams to be able to just put out schemes to put other guys in positions to where they have to make plays and those guys aren't able to.
Mm-hmm.
Because then all of the good stuff that he does, you're not taking advantage of it to an extent. Does that make sense?
Absolutely, it does. And we've seen that happen before. I think the biggest example is LeBron James, his first stint in Cleveland. I know he made it to one finals run, but they didn't really make trades for a little while. I guess they eventually did when they brought in an old Shaq, but we're not going to bring in a
Right.
39-year-old Shaq, right? We're smarter than that. I think they also brought in a Antoine Jameson, who was also way past his prime. But they were forced to do that because of poor decisions they made early in his career. Um, and I think the key thing that you had just said there, when you said, I don't know if it'll be Trae Young or a big splashy move, I don't think it has to be. I think that's the biggest thing. It can be something small. It could be a point guard, like you're saying, like a fringe all-star level player. It could be something else. I think Victor Wembanyama's point in the comments is completely valid when he says Brian Wright aiming for a dynasty. You don't build a dynasty the Suns or Lakers route. You build a dynasty the Nuggets and Warriors and OKC route. I see where he's coming from, but here's what I come back with. The Nuggets traded for Aaron Gordon. The Warriors, right before they went on their run, traded for Andre Iguodala. And OKC traded for their best player, Shai Gilgeous-Alexander. I know he was still young, but all 3 teams made trades early to combine with their young core and then take that next step. And I don't think Andre Iguodala's was a huge move at the time. I even remember distinctly watching a video, but pre the season they went on that first amazing run, and they were like, "Nah, he's not going to be that big of a difference maker." They lost key players like Jarrett Jack. Imagine this back then. They lost Jarrett Jack. They lost Carl Landry. They're going to implode. And no, they went on one of the greatest runs of all time, right? And I think that's a great valid point. But on the other hand, just to bring up the con, like you were saying, we saw a team make a similar move last year in the offseason. They went and signed Fred VanVleet, and they went and signed, what's old boy's name?
Dylan Brooks.
Dylan Brooks. 2 veteran players, a fringe all-star point guard, and a veteran 3-and-D, culture guy in Dylan Brooks. And how are they doing right now?
I'm pulling it
Not
up.
very well. They're 11th out of the play-in by 4 games. And I don't think they're going to be able to make the play-in tournament. And I know their process is kind of similar to what we were saying. They had 2 really good young players in Alper and Şengün, and Jalen Green. They were like, we want to make a push to compete. We've been tanking too long. They're ready to take that next step. Let's surround them with veteran players that can teach them how to compete and win. I don't think it's escalated to the point that they were hoping it would, which is why I understand where guys are coming from when they say just play it safe, how we've been doing it, don't make a move.
Yeah. The one thing I will say about the Rockets thing, and we'll see how it plays out, because maybe it just doesn't work out and then they're just stuck in mediocrity, you know,
Yeah.
or fighting for the play-in again next season. And it's
Mm-hmm.
like, okay, why did we make these moves?
Exactly.
Which is kind of what blah 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 is saying here. He says Rockets are exactly the example to avoid. They ruined their young core development just to pretend to be better.
We don't want that.
Here's the flip side though. What have the past couple Rocket seasons been like? Probably like close to 60 lost seasons the past 2 years,
Yeah.
past maybe even longer than that, right? But if you want to look at the Thunder's trajectory, what did they do last season? They were the 10 seed, I'm pretty sure. And I know that the Rockets are the 11 seed, but in this is a different West than even last season. You know what
True.
I mean when it comes to depth. So maybe next year is the year that the Rockets make the jump. But also, like we were just pointing out earlier, maybe it's not, and they're reminiscent of the Kemba Walker Hornets.
Mm-hmm.
If
Yeah,
you remember that.
I do. I do. And the last point I want to make real quick, I personally have nothing against taking our time, playing out the rebuild, not making a trade. Nothing wrong with that. I think it would probably work. In a couple years, we'd probably be exactly where we want to be, right? In like 3 or 4 years,
Mm-hmm.
whatever. Where I come back to being pro trade slightly, and like I said, not saying it has to be Trae Young. It could be just a role player, a solid veteran. But where I come back to that point is Victor Wembanyama is a different breed, and I don't want him to feel like we're not exploring every avenue to get better and compete and surround him with winning talent. Because I do think, as much as I love him and love his maturity, I do think he's the type to make noise if he doesn't feel like the front office is doing everything they can to win. Does that make sense?
Yes, and here's the other thing. He's going to be the most coveted free agent of all time,
Mm-hmm.
potentially. That's the other thing we got to remember, too. Like, there's going to be every big team is going to offer him like a gigantic bag. And I wholeheartedly believe that the Spurs are actually going to get an extension done before all that. And it'll
Mm-hmm.
be like one of the craziest extensions probably ever announced
Probably.
at the time that it's announced, just because with his French connections, the picture of him in the Tony jersey when he was young, the him fist pumping when the Rockets didn't get the first pick. Like, you know what I mean? This all Boris. I mean, the
Mm-hmm.
connections just go on and on. I think this is where he wants to be. I really do.
I do too.
And I think this is where he wanted to be coming into the league. That's what he said himself. But like you said, he respects himself at the same time.
Mm-hmm.
And there's some things you got to do. The other thing that when it comes to this trade, I think there's a potential that you could do a trade to get some potential, whatever it may be, but an upgrade at
Mm-hmm.
specific positions, whether it's shooting wise, intangibles, etc. I
Mm-hmm.
think you could do that and still keep the Spurs pick that they have this season, which they're probably going to have the highest odds. They'll have the top 3 odds for the lottery when it plays out. And even if they don't, it's going to be a very high pick. Most likely, it'll be a top 5 pick. Um, I don't think that the Spurs are going to strike lightning twice. I don't know if
Mm-hmm.
that's ever happened in NBA history. Um,
Once.
who was it?
Cleveland, Anthony Bennett, Andrew Wiggins, back-to-back years.
Gosh. Well, now you've got my conspiracy brain running
But they
because
traded both of those guys.
who did they end up getting? Who did
Kevin
Cleveland?
Love.
Oh, but you see what I'm saying? That was all set up after LeBron signed with them.
Mm-hmm. So it could be a combo. I know I said I don't think we're going to sign a free agent just because we historically haven't, other than LaMarcus Aldridge. But I think that I don't know the full details, but the new what do you call it?
CBA.
CBA. You kind of have to spend your money. Like you can't just sit on it anymore. So maybe what we do is we use the free agency period to fill in our role players, and then maybe we have to trade some of our younger role player assets with maybe a mixture of draft capital to go after a bigger splash. And maybe it's not this offseason, but down the line is probably going to happen.
Remind me what I was just talking about right before we got to that point.
You were like, I don't think we're in the lottery odds for the top three, but you didn't think it was going to happen.
Yes. I mean, and we'll have to see. Like you said, maybe free agency is the move. But the bigger point I was getting at there is I think there's a potential that the Spurs make a move like this and still use their top pick,
Mhm. Yeah,
which allows you to kind of add two stars. It allows you to kind of play the game of both a little bit because you're adding another super young talent, but you're also and also he'll have a full rookie contract. A lot of these other guys, their contracts are winding down. As much as I
Mhm.
mean, look, at this point after this season, we're going to be in the third year for Blake, Malachi, and Jeremy. That means there's only like a year left on the team option, which means we're basically already in extension talk time potentially.
Yeah.
Are you going to be able to pay all three of those guys? I hate to bring that up right now,
Mhm.
but it's a little closer than we think. You know what I mean? So maybe and maybe it's not those guys. Maybe it's someone like Keldon. I just really doubt that Devin is going to be in any trade talks whatsoever. And we've talked about this at nauseum before. He just fits next to whoever we bring in because of his shooting and off the dribble scoring ability. Um, and also because he can kind of play the two or the three too. I saw
Mhm.
somebody else was talking about that earlier, like maybe even because of Devin's versatility, if we wanted to, we could move him to the three if we brought somebody else in that plays the one or the two. I don't think that that's necessarily going to happen, but the point is that Devin is very versatile when it comes to roster building, on top of being having all-star potential. Um, Potentially. He's at the least a 20-point scorer and a solid defender. I think he's proven that at this point at 23, and I think he's only going to get better under the Spurs development. That's why I say I think he has all-star potential. Um, but with all of that being said, Ethan, what are your thoughts on that draft pick in this conversation is I guess what I'm asking.
If we can hold on to it, I think that's amazing. Like you said, to bring in a potential top three pick and then also make a trade to bring in a nice veteran piece that can help us win now. I think that wins on both fronts. Because, like you said, we're not going to have enough roster space, let alone money, to pay everybody or draft everybody that we have enough assets for. Um, so I think that's a win-win. If we can get away with it, we can get away with it. I think if we are to make a big splash play, however, it's likely that that pick will have to be included. But the whole big splash play, it's so here and there. Like there's so little you can actually like that's tangible you could talk about. Like Trae Young's the big one, right? That's the one everyone's talking about. I personally really, really like Trae Young. I think he would help our team a lot. I think he solves a lot of our problems, considering he's made it to the playoffs pretty consistently. Went to the Eastern Conference Finals when he was the only star on his team. I think he gets a lot of unwarranted hate. But other than him, I don't really know of anyone else that's currently available, right?
Yeah.
So we can't even speculate. Like, would you include this pick for blank player or blank play? Like, we can't even have those conversations because, as far as I know, there's really no other All Star point guard players on the trading block.
Yeah, not as far as I know either. Now, granted, I will say in the off season, a lot of times that kind of stuff becomes a little bit more public knowledge with all of the whether it's the draft and people talking to each other. Obviously, there's a lot of moves made on the draft as well. But even at like summer league and stuff, you start to hear like these storylines come out at all of these like kind of conference like events, even though they're not conferences. It's just like events throughout the off season that a lot of like front office staff are at. Like I
Mm-hmm.
mentioned, whether it's the draft or the combine or summer league, whatever it may be. Um, but I'm completely losing my train of thought
I
here,
think you were just
Ethan.
going to say there may be some storylines where people are available once we get into the offseason, after the playoffs.
Yes, that we could figure out who, like you were saying, you don't know who's available. We could end up finding that out. That is a potential as well. But the other thing is when maybe the Spurs start floating their packages as well in
Mm.
these conversations, like if of course if the Spurs decide to do this. That's another thing. I've been talking about it in this tone. You also reiterated this. I'm not going to be mad also if they just decide to ride it out and kind of bring everybody back for next year, and maybe the my thought going into this season of everything meshing together better and them clicking and competing for the play-in, maybe that does end up happening. I think that's a little sunshine and rainbowy, to be completely honest with you. I think probably if we bring back this year's team, I think probably like around 30 wins is a little bit more of a realistic goal, if I'm being just completely honest. Because this season, I got to be humbled somewhat with how the predictions this season went. But that aside, it'll be interesting to watch. I guess that's really, and you don't know what's tangible and what's not, like you were saying. But once we start floating out some packages, that's what I was trying to get to. There might be some people who weren't necessarily available before, but maybe some GMs look at that and be like, well, if we got some of those guys, I think that might actually be a better fit for our team, like in Atlanta, for example. And I know that's not even to just bring up the Trae Young thing again, because I see some comments that we have in here too of people being like, I'm not very fond of Trae Young's defense, and I understand what you're saying. And I understand what Ethan's saying too. And I will say that I think if you're going to bring in somebody with defensive woes, I think putting him next to Victor is probably the best scenario where you could do that. But that's really all besides the point. I just bring up Atlanta as an example of a team that is kind of wanting to maybe restructure things right now. And there's some other ones out there as well, or maybe some that are kind of coming into that realization, like maybe like the Suns or something. Some of these teams that are in the play-in right now that have constructed these big rosters, with all these big contracts, maybe they might think it might be better for them to kind of restructure some things and add in some more role players next to some of their guys. Long-winded way of saying that. I think Minnesota last season, like maybe an example of that. And we saw that worked out for them this year. So, and that was a little bit different because they had to adjust with Rudy and Cat. But the point that I'm trying to make here is there might be some teams that want to reshuffle things, see the deal that the Spurs have with the young guys on the potential package, having potential for their team and thinking that it fits well. So that's a long-winded way of saying that. But
time will tell. And just to speak on Trae Young's defensive lapses and whatnot, if you're going to get someone that's not very good at defense, might as well grab a guy that's averaged 30 and 10 before, led the league in assists, taken his team to the Eastern Conference Finals, and is regarded as probably one of the top 5 point guards in the NBA, I would say.
Yeah. I think him and Wemby in a two-man game, that's going to make up for whatever points he gives up. And also, I think that Wemby is going to be able to block a lot of shots if he gets beat off the dribble. But I also think that the Spurs development staff and the Spurs coaching staff would make him a little bit better defensively. Call me crazy. But I understand people's apprehensions, especially like if you're able to go make a move like that, maybe there's somebody else that is available that doesn't, have that can score. That's a volume scorer that also is a good defender. But that ties back into what you were saying earlier. We don't really know who's available. So anyways.
No, you're right. Like a lot of people want to say Tyrese Halliburton. This isn't 2K. He's not available. Like there's no package we can give up unless we include Victor Wembanyama that Indiana's going to say yes to.
Yeah, that sums it up perfectly there, Ethan. We don't really know, but I wanted to describe it as a big splashy move because at the end of the day, the potential trade that we're talking about is something that would upgrade Victor's supporting cast so that the schemes that have been put against us this season aren't able to just be spammed and work every game next year.
Well said, my friend.
Here is one maybe potential thing, and I've heard this before, but Andrew Camarillo says Darius Garland or Donovan Mitchell may become available if the Cleveland postseason goes sideways. And I think if that happened, I would definitely lean to Darius Garland. There's some other people saying that, but this is also a big if, because if Cleveland puts it together and like makes the Eastern Conference Finals, then they're going to want to keep everybody. So, but that's also why when we were talking about it earlier, as the postseason plays out, it'll become a little bit more clear who's potentially available.
I think the Cleveland situation will much more likely come down to not Cleveland picking one or the other, but Donovan Mitchell saying deuces. And then they'll be like, okay, well, we're keeping Darius Garland now because we need him.
maybe Mitchell to the Knicks will come true. But now that I'm saying that, like the way Jalen Brunson has been playing and the way they have to pay him, I don't know what
Yeah.
their cap looks like right now.
They have room.
They do.
They could make a move this offseason. I think that they have a big free agent coming their way this year.
Interesting. Interesting. Our guy July 26th says, "Sweet hats, fellas." And I appreciate him saying that because that reminds me, Ethan, if you want to go check out the SSPN spread shop, go to sspn.myspreadshop.com. The link's in the description. It's also in the channel description. But if you don't want to do that, pull out your phone and scan this QR code. We got a little bit of some of our gear there. Ethan and I both got the hats on. I was going to wear my SSPN shirt today, but it wasn't clean. I thought it was, but it ended up being in the dirty clothes hamper. So I wasn't able to wear it, but we still got the hat.
It's a very comfortable hat. Everyone go buy one, please.
I love the way you said that. Anyways, if you guys would like to support the channel, that is a great way to do so. But with all that being said, Ethan, I think that pretty much wraps up this conversation. Any final thoughts on just potential moves this offseason for the Spurs?
Something will happen, and it will probably be the most like out of the ordinary, like what the heck kind of move is that we've ever seen.
It's gonna be like when we drafted Primo. Like we're just gonna be like, huh?
Mm-hmm. Yep.
But it'll be the trade version of it. Oh my gosh. We appreciate you guys hanging out with us today and giving all your opinions and all that good stuff. Stay tuned to the channel. Follow us on Twitter at SSPNONYT, at Jude McLaren, and at Ethan_Quintero if you want to know when our next post games will be. And also, if you enjoyed the content, don't forget to hit that like and that subscribe button below. We appreciate you guys. We'll catch you on the next one. Go Spurs, go.